Scotland's last remaining oil refinery at Grangemouth is set to close by the summer with more than 400 redundancies. It's a prospect which the trade union Unite has described as a needless act of industrial vandalism. Our two governments, which have come under pressure over the issue, have continually pledged to do all they can to support the refinery workers. To that end, they've spent £1.5 million on Project Willow to assess the feasibility of the facility turning into a low-carbon energy hub. That much-awaited report is due out later this month. But STV's political editor Colin Mackay has already seen some of it and joined us from Holyrood. Colin, what are some of the key findings in this report?
Well, it's a £1.5 million feasibility study into basically turning the Grangemouth oil refinery, which is due to close in the next couple of months, into a producer of low-carbon energy. So it's really proposing 9 projects over 20 years to create that low energy hub. And I suppose the main things that it's aiming for is sustainable aviation fuel and also producing hydrogen. Now, to create sustainable aviation fuel would cost £800 million roughly of capital investment. Even to get this whole project started over the next 5 years, maybe creating as many as 400 jobs, that would cost £500 million. The whole project, as proposed here, would cost billions of pounds. It says that there are 4 key asks of Project Willow to make it succeed. One is that the government must de-risk the investment in new technologies, and it will need to offer financial support to do that. 2, it would need to support low-carbon energy markets to help them compete with the existing fossil fuels. Now, 3 is mobilise and scale supply chains, and 4 is update policy regulation. Those are the 4 key asks or key recommendations, I suppose, of Project Willow.
And how likely are these proposals to come to fruition in the short term to aid the current workforce?
Well, that's where Unite the Union and the local politicians diverge with what's being proposed in Project Willow. Now, Project Willow hasn't been properly published yet, hasn't been fully published yet. It might seem a bit more positive by the end of this month when it is due to be published, when we see the full report. But from what I've seen, it really backs up the concerns and the scepticism from the union and from the local politicians that it does nothing to save the jobs that are threatened right now. You know, the people who work there got their redundancy letters last week. It does nothing for them. And because of the scale of the capital investment required by this, it's way too much for the Scottish Government to even have a look in. And the way the UK Government and INEOS have been going over recent years, it seems very unlikely that they're going to be willing to come up with the billions of pounds required to invest and create these new low-carbon energy jobs.
Colin, thank you. For another perspective on efforts to secure the future of Grangemouth, we were joined by Dr Ewan Gibbs, who's an economic and energy historian. Dr Gibbs, how viable do you think these projects are?
Well, I think the big question is, where is the money going to come from? You know, I think the workers at Grangemouth are committed to using their skills in a transition towards green manufacturing. I've interviewed workers in their 20s, 30s and 40s have described to me that they expect to be part of a transition across their lifetime. So I don't think there's a question about that. But the big question is, where is the money going to come from? And what's the role of government in securing that investment? You know, the problem at Grangemouth right now is the key decisions are being made in boardrooms, in some cases on the other side of the world, or they're being made by a privately listed company in the form of INEOS, and its key shareholder Jim Ratcliffe is calling the shots. So unless we have some sort of embedded guarantee, I think, and a trajectory, a timetable of investment that's been committed to, at the end of the day, this doesn't amount to much more than a wish list.
And certainly when Colin was talking, he spoke about huge figures, huge sums involved in this. Is it realistic that that will be found?
Well, the energy transition is going to be very, very expensive. And I think that's just a fact of life. If we're going to move towards a green energy system, just as moving towards a oil-based energy system from a coal-based system was very, very expensive in the middle of the 20th century, and we did build Grangemouth through that experience. So I don't think it's impossible that could be achieved, but it would need to be achieved, I think, with considerably more direct government involvement and guidance than we've seen up to now. This is a major political project at the end of the day, and I think hoping that a Chinese state-owned enterprise and INEOS are going to deliver that for us isn't viable, I don't think, for the long run.
So what realistically can both governments do, the UK and Scottish government?
I think particularly at UK level, it's about the sums of money that are involved. I think at Scottish level, it's probably more about cohering and getting parties round the table. There has to be some sort of sense of, I think, collective agreement, a social contract, if we want, between the workers, the communities, the owners and government on the future. There has to be commitment from all sides. Now, I think the workers have demonstrated their commitment over decades at Grangemouth, and workers who chose to stay at Grangemouth after the major dispute in 2013 and through recent waves of redundancy have shown strong commitment, but they're now facing redundancy in May. So I think in the immediacy we need to find a way to keep those hundreds of workers that are directly employed at the refinery who got issued with redundancy notices, but also thousands more in the supply chain that are facing job loss in work around the energy sector in Grangemouth, because if they are not there, it's going to be much more difficult to coordinate the sort of transition over the next decade and a half that's outlined in this plan.
So what realistically can be done in the short term? We're talking about billions of pounds in the transition, but what realistically can be done in the short term to retain these workers?
I think the refinery should be kept open in the immediacy in order to plan the transition in a feasible way that doesn't leave us with an import terminal dependent on importing further volumes of refined products from around the world, which compromises our energy security but also compromises our plan of moving towards a greener energy system.
And presumably, if we don't retain these workers, you've spoken to a lot of these workers, although they would be looking forward to working in a sustainable energy, a lot of them are thinking, no, I'm going to have to emigrate now.
Yeah, I spoke to workers who really felt like they'd made it and achieved a lot by completing an apprenticeship at Grangemouth. It's a sought-after position in the local community, and these are workers maybe in their 20s into their 30s, into their early 40s, men and women that have begun to start families in the community who've shown commitment. And it's worth saying that in the last 10-15 years, workers have left Grangemouth to go and work in the Middle East, Asia and elsewhere in the international oil industry. And I spoke to workers last year who were grimly weighing up the same option. That wasn't what their preference was, but they were saying, well, if our skills aren't going to be validated and recognised in Grangemouth where we've honed them, then if necessary we will go to Saudi Arabia or Australia. And that's a huge loss to the Scottish economy if that takes place. And
briefly and finally, these big sustainability projects, do they necessarily deliver jobs?
No. And I think that's why this needs to be planned for very, very carefully. The danger is that we repeat what we've already seen with the wind industry, where Scotland now has a large wind farm sector onshore and increasingly offshore, but the number of jobs, particularly industrial jobs in manufacturing that were hoped for, simply haven't been delivered.
Dr Gibbs, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks very much.